Coming up, I'll liken the Trump blitzkrieg to a military operation and define its key characteristics. I want to talk about the political and the economic logic of tariffs. I've got a fascinating new guest from England, Charles Cornish Dale, who calls himself Raw Egg Nationalist. We're going to talk about RFK Jr., and we're going to talk about making America healthy again. Hey, if you're watching on Rumble or YouTube or listening on Apple, Google, or Spotify, please hit the subscribe or the follow button. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
The latest bombshell out of the Trump administration, they're getting ready to put into motion the abolition of the Department of Education. A huge development, a very positive one, and not an easy one. It's a positive development because the Department of Education is, in fact, antithetical to education. First of all, it should be really clear that no one is educated in this so-called Department of Education. It is merely a bureaucratic mechanism to advance bureaucracy, to empower teachers' unions, and to protect the interests of the education class, not the consumers, not the students, most certainly not the parents. And of course, it is notorious for its bad results. But even the bad results are a matter of complete indifference for the bureaucrats in the Department of Education. Why? Because for them, it's a job creation program. They're not interested in the improved educational outcomes of students. They know that they're terrible. They make no efforts to improve them. All that they do is keep demanding more and more money, and they've been getting more and more money pretty much nonstop since the 1960s. And the results continue to be bad. So instead of them thinking, how do we make the results better? I think that the way that the bureaucrats reason is that we notice that when test scores keep going down and down and down, the bureaucrats, the politicians keep giving us more and more money. In other words, we have an interest in people learning less and less because that's the way we get more and more funding to, quote, solve that problem. So you can see why this is an infestation. It is a cesspool. It needs to be removed. But it's not easy to remove because unlike some of these kind of rogue agencies that have run way beyond any kind of congressional delegation of power. They're doing all kinds of stuff on their own. And I think this is why Elon Musk has realized that he can slash these things, of course, with Trump's approval, but he can slash these agencies because these agencies don't have congressional standing behind them. The Congress may have said, hey, listen, we're going to ask the Food and Drug Agency, for example, to monitor the quality of food, but the Food and Drug Agency does 700 things that it was never authorized by Congress to do. So no reason that those 700 things can't be slashed. As Debbie and I were driving to the podcast, I showed her, I said, listen, they're locking people out at the Office of Personnel Management. They've turned off the passwords of people at the USAID. And I was just describing this kind of flurry of activity going on. And Debbie was like, well, what if the other side did all this? And I'm like, they already have. This is what they've been doing all along. They've taken over the system. They've set up all these passwords. It's not that we've been locked out. We've never been allowed in. So they've been running these rackets to their heart's content. No wonder they're screaming. What the screaming is simply a way of saying our racket is about to end. Now, they never say this. They say things like democracy is about to end, or civilization is about to end, or our way of government is about to end. It's kind of like what might happen if, let's just say I'm overspending on our family credit card, And Debbie goes, hey, it looks like from our bank account we're running out of money. Can I look at your credit card? And I'm like, Debbie, you're a threat to democracy. You're a threat to human civilization. You're a threat to the normal way of doing government. In fact, marriage as an institution may come to an end if we start looking at if I start giving you access to our credit cards. In other words, accountability will not be tolerated around here. Now, Reagan promised to end the Department of Education. He didn't do it. I don't blame him for it. Reagan was focused on the Cold War. He was focused on other things. One of the remarkable things about Trump is the way this guy has been doing the blitzkrieg on every front. And it's worth stepping back and taking note of that, because this is a kind of administrative civil war we're seeing. We haven't seen it in our lifetime, and so it's new. And people say, well, it's chaos. It's actually not chaos. It's the opposite of chaos, because the Trump approach is very deliberate. It's obviously been thought out. It is targeted. It is surgical. It is swift. The chaos is on the other side, because the left is taken by surprise. They don't know what hit them. And so they're running all over the place and screaming their heads off. And so the chaos that they're talking about is not the chaos of the assault. It's the chaos of the people who have been dispersed by the assault. And this is not what we saw in 2016. In fact, I saw an interesting post this morning which described what's happening in the government right now in terms of military strategy. And the post talks about what are the key elements of successful military strategy. Let's enumerate them so we can apply them and see how this is exactly what is going on here. And Trump and Elon Musk are the two most obvious sort of symbols of it, but lots of people are carrying it out. Even Elon Musk is not carrying it out on his own. In fact, he's got a little army of superstar geeks who are helping him carry it out. And there are many people in the government. In fact, ultimately, it's going to be the whole platoon of the Trump cabinet that is moving on these fronts. So this is the military strategy. One, the element of surprise. And we see that here. No one thought that the Trump people were going to come out of the gate. We're seeing quotes in the media like, they never did this the last time. Yeah, exactly. This time we've caught you by surprise. Number two, concentration. Concentration refers here to density of force being applied to a single point. So you don't just send one guy in, you send 8 guys who are software engineers and know a whole lot more about computers and software than the people who work in those departments. Number 3, tempo. Tempo here refers to speed and refers to the pace of the operation. 4, audacity. Audacity means where they least expect it. They're looking out. It's kind of like some guys looking out through the window with binoculars. Hit him from behind. Boom. The audacity of it takes you by surprise because he didn't realize you were already in the room. The next, maneuverability. Maneuverability is the fact that you're not only moving in, but once you get in there, you know how to operate. In other words, you get into a building, you're like, let me see where the passwords are stored. Or in the case of Elon Musk, you have all these people getting money. Let me see where this money is coming from. Where's the spigot? Where's the faucet? Who's turning it on? How do I turn it off? Firepower. Firepower is you use your kind of lethal and non-lethal means, and your idea is to suppress the enemy forces, destroy their capabilities. Initiative. Initiative refers here to getting an edge, to seizing the advantage and holding on to it. Flexibility. Flexibility means you don't go in with a single blueprint and go, I have to follow this blueprint. Flexibility is, here's my general plan, but I'm going to adapt to circumstances. If I see an obstacle over here, I'm going to move over there. And finally, synchronization. Synchronization means working in harmony, which is to say, obviously, in the military sense, you've got the cavalry, you've got the infantry. I'm thinking here, of course, the old Prussian formula, which is artillery, cavalry, And so you're moving ultimately in all fronts. In World War II, of course, it referred to the fact that when you have a ground invasion, you want to have air cover. So the air cover bombs the targets into submission, and then the ground troops move in, facing much less resistance than they otherwise would. All of these strategies are fully observable. And obviously in politically modified form. And this is why the left is seized by, so Andrew Weissman on television, I guess this was yesterday, he's talking about there's a feeling of terror inside the FBI. And when I hear things like that, I feel just a quiet sense of satisfaction. It reminds me of Cassius and Julius Caesar, where there's a storm raging outside. Everyone's complaining about the storm, and Cassius goes, "This is a very good night for honest men." And that's how we should feel, because all the terror, all the chaos, all the people running for cover, these are basically all the bad guys. These are the guys who have been essentially collecting money, making backdoor deals, sitting tight in bureaucratic sinecures, doing absolutely nothing. Their life, their schedule, their peace has been disrupted, and it's really a glorious thing to behold. Debbie and I really care about our health, and we've come across a remarkable device I want to tell you about. It's a total game changer. It's called Juvent Micro Impact Platform. It's based on the latest cutting-edge science. It uses micro impact frequency to promote joint health, improve bone density, boost circulation, even stimulate the production of stem cells in your body. It sounds crazy, right? But it works. All you have to do is stand on this platform, stand on it for 10 minutes a day. That's it. It's going to make those crinks and stiffness and aches and pains vanish. It can even add up to 5 years to your life. Wow. You got to learn about this new technology. It's not to be confused with some gimmicky vibration plates out there. Go to juvent.com/Dinesh to learn more. That's Juvent, JUVENT.com/Dinesh. They've got a great deal for you, $500 off. 10-year warranty, financing options, even a 6-week buyback promise, because they believe in the product so much. Juvent can change your life. Check it out. Learn more. Go to juvent.com/Dinesh. Numbers do not lie. The impact that Balance of Nature makes every single day is pretty astounding. You can see the numbers for yourself on their website. Go to balanceofnature.com and check them out. Now listen to a few stats concerning Balance of Nature's worldwide success. More than 1,000 success stories reported each month. Hundreds of thousands of customers worldwide. Millions of orders delivered each year. And billions, yes, billions of these. Fruits and veggies in a capsule. These are fruit and veggie supplements consumed by people who have decided to start living better. There's only one number missing. That is you. Do what I did. Add yourself to these numbers. Start taking Balance of Nature's whole food supplements like so many others around the world. Here's another number that might get your attention, 35%. Use my discount code, America. You get 35% off plus free shipping and a money-back guarantee. Here's the number to call, 800-246-8751. Again, 800-246-8751, or go to balanceofnature.com. When you use discount code America, you get 35% off plus free shipping. There's a new poll out on the favorability of the two parties. The favorability of the Republican Party is just under 50%, which is about the same as it's been in a little while, and it's not bad. The significant fact here is the drop in the favorability of the Democratic Party is huge. The Democratic Party currently is at 31% favorability. So this means that people are waking up to what this party is all about. And I feel a real sense of gratification over all this, because a lot of my films and my career has been devoted, certainly in the last 10 years of movie making, to exposing the historical crimes of the Democratic Party, which continue to this day. The Democratic Party has always been the party of the plantation. When I was in the Reagan administration, I know that many of us used to say, you know, we're really conservatives more than we are Republicans. But I realized that this is a wrong way to think, because It wasn't conservatives who ended slavery. It was the Republican Party. It wasn't conservatives who fought against a lot of the New Deal programs and the Great Society. It was the Republican Party. The Republican Party, in other words, is the mechanism for resisting the Democrats. And so who are these 31% of people who continue to support the Democratic Party? I think they fall into three categories. And see if you can think of any others. There may be a couple more that I'm missing, but I think these are the three main ones. One, people who benefit from looting the Treasury. That's a lot of people, by the way. By and large, it's people who are taking a lot more out of the system than they ever put in, or they're taking a lot more out of the system than other people. They're relying on other people to bankroll their lifestyle. So that's one group of people, and that's fairly significant. You can see why these are the people who jump up and down when the Democrats always promising, I'm going to excuse your loans, which is another way of saying I'm going to make somebody else pay for your loans. I'm going to give you an abatement on your rent. I'm going to get somebody else to pay for your rent. So this is one group of people. The second is white progressives who enjoy being overseers on the Democratic plantation. It's very enjoyable for these white liberals to have large numbers of blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans kind of at their behest. Please help me. So these whites become social workers, or they become part of the academic sector that justifies the kind of plantation policies of the Democratic Party. And they love being in this position because they see themselves as being benefactors. But notice that they're not benefactors with their own money. None of them ever say things like, oh, you know what, I'm in the barrio, let me donate my car. They never do that. Their idea of being a benefactor is taking it from somebody else and then giving it to this guy so that this guy then owes you politically or owes you bureaucratically. And the third, of course, is criminals and perverts of every stripe. I mean, you add these three groups and I think you're going to get roughly, well, 31%. Let me turn and say a couple of words about tariffs. Because I think we're now seeing the tariffs that Trump promised on Mexico have been postponed for a month. And the tariffs he promised on Canada have been postponed for a month, which is kind of another way of saying that Trump didn't see tariffs as an end in themselves. If he did, we'd see the tariffs in effect. If Trump thought that tariffs are kind of good on their own, well, where are the tariffs? The only tariffs that are in effect right now are the 10% tariffs on China. But why are the tariffs being suspended for Mexico and for Canada? Because both have agreed, A, to deploy 10,000 troops each on the border, B, to control the flow of fentanyl, and in the case of Mexico, to arrest cartel members. Now, let's talk about that. The cartel members, because I see right here, news report, Mexico has just arrested El Ricky, a top leader of Cartel del Noreste. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. If they just arrested him, they probably could have arrested him last year, or the year before that, or the year before that. Why didn't they arrest him before? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. He was probably paying off the politicians in Mexico. They were doing business with this guy. They had no intention of arresting him. They certainly could. They knew exactly where he was. So why did they arrest him now? The answer is, again, just as clear. And that is, Trump increased the price of their cozy relationship with the cartels. In other words, they were getting a benefit out of the cartels. But Trump said to them, hey, that benefit is going to be more than canceled out by 25% tariffs, which, by the way, Trump said might go to 50. And these tariffs will be a wrecking ball into the Mexican economy. And so these politicians then go, oh, well, you know what? Now it's preferable to arrest this guy because the pain that Trump is promising here is greater than the pleasure we get from doing business with this guy and receiving payments under the table from the cartels. This is the Trump Trump changes really the whole, you may say, algorithm of calculation. That's, by the way, how Rick Grenell was able to go down to Venezuela and get those guys out. Basically, Maduro goes, listen, I want to stay on the good side of Trump because if I annoy him too much, a missile might come in through my window. That wouldn't be good. So let me give these 6 guys back. Maybe, I'll kind of get on Trump's good side. So this is sort of like a valet who says, I better pick up the guy's bag. He's known to have a temper. I may get fired. And so Maduro doesn't just worry about getting fired. I think he worries about being fired upon. Which would be very bad for him, of course. Now, let's turn to this issue of fentanyl, because here's Brian Tyler Cohen, a leftist on Twitter. He says, Trump just launched a trade war against Canada over fentanyl. The U.S. seized, wait for it, 43 pounds at the U.S.-Canada border last year. 43 pounds. The message here is 43 pounds of fentanyl is nothing. That's it, 43 pounds. And yet, 43 pounds of fentanyl, I looked it up, can kill about 10 million people. So this kind of reminds me of remember George Carlin's routines where he would have this sort of black humor. He'd be like, well, I don't know why they have, speed limits on the highway. He goes, I know they tell you it's to save lives. He goes, guess how many people were killed on the highway last year? 65,000. Then he goes, that's it. And, of course, the black humor here is to the pretense, of course, that 65,000 is like some small number. And so we're almost here in a George Carlin routine. We seize 43 pounds of fentanyl. 43 pounds of fentanyl can kill 10 million people. That's it. Just 10 million. All this fuss over 10 million lives. So the point here is that this promiscuous flow of drugs across the border has been the ruin of innumerable communities. And it's because the people in those communities have been politically relatively powerless that politicians have completely ignored them. Who cares? For the Biden people, it's like, we'd rather import some new voters. And if a bunch of fentanyl comes across the border, well, that's a price that we're happy to pay. After all, the price is not being felt by anybody we know. And Trump, on the other hand, has once again changed the equation. And his tariffs, as we can see, are aimed at behavior modification. So you can judge the Trump tariffs by simply saying, does the behavior that he seeks to modify, has it worked? Has it in fact modified the behavior of Canada? Answer, yes. Has it in fact modified the behavior of Mexico? Answer, once again, yes. For years, customers have been asking if MyPillow sells cross necklaces like the one Mike Lindell proudly wears every day. Well, MyPillow is excited to announce that Mike has partnered with a jeweler right here in the USA to create beautiful sterling silver My Crosses. You can save 30% today, 30%, using promo code Dinesh at mypillow.com, or you can call 800-876-0227. You can choose from the women's or men's style. The My Cross for women, it has a more delicate look. It's reversible with mother-of-pearl style translucent white enamel on one side and onyx-styled black enamel on the other. The My Cross for men, it has a slightly larger cross with onyx-style black enamel and a slightly longer, thicker chain. This amazing offer, 30% off, won't last long, so order now. Call 800-876-0227 or go to mypillow.com. Don't forget to use the promo code. It's DINESH, Dinesh. Hey guys, I'm very pleased to welcome to the podcast a new guest, Charles Cornish Dale. He calls himself Raw Egg Nationalist, and we're going to find out what that means. He's the star of the recent Tucker Carlson documentary called The End of Men. He's also the author of The Eggs Benedict Option. The website is raweggstack.com. You can follow him on X at babygravy9. Wow. Charles, welcome. Great to have you on the podcast. And I'm especially pleased because this topic of health, of food, how we keep our bodies in shape, not something I cover very much on the podcast at all. And yet it has come into the forefront of American politics via one Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whose nomination to the cabinet just went through committee. It was kind of narrow, one vote margin, but he goes before the whole Senate, where I think his likelihood of being confirmed is excellent at this point. Let me begin by asking you about this idea of being a raw egg nationalist. What do you mean by that?
Well, thanks for having me, Dinesh. So basically, the idea behind raw egg nationalism is that a nation is only as healthy as the individuals of which it is composed. And so that's actually, I mean, really, that's the animating idea behind Make America Healthy Again, too, is that America faces unprecedented sickness. You've got 70% of adults are either overweight or obese. It's an enormous burden on the nation. It's an enormous burden on the nation's finances. It's a diversion from better things. We're talking billions, trillions of dollars even that could be spent on infrastructure, on great projects. You could go to Mars. We could have multiple manned flights to Mars, but instead we're paying huge amounts of money to deal with the enormous burden of chronic disease, of diabetes, of obesity, of cancer, of bowel conditions, all sorts of stuff, behavioral conditions like autism and ADHD, which also appear to be linked to diet and lifestyle. So raw egg nationalism really is about strengthening the individual as a way of sort of strengthening the nation as well. And raw eggs are a big part of that. So eggs are one of these superfoods, really. It's one of nature's great superfoods, like milk, for example. And over the last 70 years, eggs, animal products in general, have been demonized to a tremendous extent, and we've been told to give them up in order to be more healthy, in order to reduce rates of heart disease, for example. But actually, the opposite has happened. We've abandoned these miracle foods from nature, and we've become sicker than ever. Who would have thought? Well, there were people who spoke out at the time, but that's what we've done. And so it's about returning to traditional diets rooted in animal foods, and like I say, fortifying the individual to fortify the nation.
I want to ask how we got to this point. I mean, it's something, I came to the United States in 1978, I guess it was, as an exchange student. Americans in general were not obese. I mean, there were a handful of people who were overweight, but even then they were not circus overweight. They weren't ridiculously overweight. But now that's become common to see. You just have to walk through, the airport in Tulsa or Birmingham, and it's quite a sight, really. So my question is this, in my earlier career, I used to think that these things are the result of sort of errors of thinking. In other words, that somehow people get the wrong idea that moving away, let's say, from eggs or meat is a better way to go. But I think in more recent years, I've come to the view that much of this is driven by very powerful economic interests that have captured the agencies of government. And so what you have is a symbiotic relationship between politicians in search of money and very profitable companies that stand to gain from serving you very bad but maybe cheaper foods. Am I sort of onto something as to how we got from there to here?
Yes, you are. And in fact, Dinesh, actually, you sound quite a lot like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when you talk about the powerful corporate interests that are driving ill health. I mean, one of the big indexes I think of, or one of the big causes of ill health, is the consumption of processed food, ultra processed food. Now, this is something that we're hearing more and more about because RFK Jr. has been talking about it. In particular, he's identified it as one of the principal causes of ill health. Well, why do Americans eat so much processed food? And one of the answers is because there's a whole system of agricultural subsidies, food production incentives that drives the overproduction of commodities like corn and soy in the Midwest. You have enormous quantities of corn and soy being produced, far more than anybody ever needed or ever would need. So what happened? Well, corn and soy producers started to find places for corn and soy to go. And that's really what processed food is. Processed food is a vehicle for the insinuation of more and more cheap corn and cheap soy into the diets of American consumers. So you have the creation of new food additives, things like high fructose corn syrup in the 1970s. That was intended, or it was marketed, as an alternative to traditional table sugar. But what actually happened was, instead of serving as an alternative to table sugar, high fructose corn syrup was simply added on top of the sugar that was already in processed goods. So Americans were then getting basically like a double dose of, you've got the sugar and high fructose corn syrup on top. And the same is true of things like soybean oil. Soybean oil is in everything. Soy protein is in everything now. So there's a system of agricultural incentives, of commercial incentives that are driving, I think, the overproduction of certain commodities and the production of certain new commodities, processed foods in particular, that are making Americans very, very ill. And RFK Jr. is right, I think, to target agricultural policy to say, look, we need a fundamental rethink of the way that the American food system works. It works in the favor of these big corporate producers. The incentives favor their bottom line. It's not actually about the kind of foods that people should be eating or need to eat. It's about making sure all the corn and soy can go somewhere, or at least that's part of it. So yes, I think it's much better to think of it in terms of systemic problems than simply problems of ignorance, let's say, or even problems of laziness. I mean, there is a moral element, of course, to people being overweight. People do choose to overeat, and people can choose to make a change and work out and change their diet. But it's much more complicated than that, I think. And thankfully, RFK Jr. is somebody who understands the way that food is produced in the US and the kind of basically perverse incentives that are driving Americans into unprecedented ill health.
I mean, I remember as a younger man that I would sometimes, have a little bit of derision toward people who seemed ridiculously overweight. My thinking was that except for a few cases where you might have a congenital problem, this is just irresponsibility and unwillingness to sort of draw the line. But now I realize that in so many areas we have been getting, bad and false information. And so, for example, the propaganda toward, low-fat milk and low-fat yogurt, all giving you the idea, hey, if I eat this low-fat yogurt, I'm not going to get fat. Not realizing that things that are low-fat, by and large, have a tremendous amount of sugar. And by the way, fat isn't all that bad for you either if consumed in the right way and in moderation. And so what's happened is that even if someone is well-meaning and says, all right, I do want to look out for my health, you're getting all this information that turns out, and not just information, by the way, from the corporate labels, but information from the agencies of government, which appear to be somewhat captive of these corporations, essentially putting you on the wrong path. Would you agree that in some way our governments have been misleading us no less than the corporate sector?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the demonization of animal products in particular, on the basis of their cholesterol and saturated fat content, was one of the greatest, basically medical scams, I think, of the last 100 years. So around about the 1940s, 1950s, US government and governments in the developed world started to get really quite worried about rising rates of heart disease, and they were looking for an explanation. And there was a nutritionist called Ansel Keys who came up with this theory that it was saturated fat and cholesterol consumption. Now, the theory actually at the time was widely ridiculed. His contemporaries didn't think it was true. They looked at the data that he used and they said, look, you've been very partial in your selection of the countries that you've used to illustrate your thesis. Actually, if you look at other countries like France, for instance, where they consume huge amounts of butter and always have done and have much lower rates of heart disease than in the US, you won't see that correlation between heart disease and saturated fat consumption. But Ansel Keys had the backing of margarine manufacturers, people who wanted to sell novel, plant-based or plant-derived fats as an alternative to animal fats. Huge amounts of money were given to Ansel Keys, to the American Heart Association by corporations like Procter and Gamble. And they pushed this line about saturated fat and heart disease. Anyway, that became the standard medical position on heart disease and on saturated fat and cholesterol. You need to minimize your consumption in order to protect your heart and to protect your health. Well, that was the standard position for 70 years, and it's been a disaster. And even today, if you go to speak to your physician, if you told your physician, I eat 12 eggs a day and steak cooked in butter, your physician will say, you're gonna give yourself a heart attack. You need to stop. When in actual fact, the science has been totally reversed. And so, decades later, we have scientists saying, actually, there's absolutely no relationship between cholesterol consumption in your diet and heart disease. So yes, I mean, it absolutely is in very many ways a matter of messaging as well. And the thing is, it's very hard actually to separate corporate interests from government. And this is part of the reason, of course, why RFK Jr.'s appointment is being very bitterly resisted, I think. And you saw it in the, when he was being grilled in front of the Senate, and Bernie Sanders was really going after him. And then RFK Jr. turns around and says, look, Bernie, you've taken millions of dollars from pharmaceutical companies. I mean, that's the reality, of course, is that government is very much in bed with these corporate interests. And it needs to change.
I mean, you're highlighting some of the, the obvious ways in which politicians collect money directly from these companies. I think that there are even subtler ways in which there is a government entanglement. Here's one of them. All our governments, yours, ours, are printing a whole lot of money, right? In other words, they're adding to the money supply. And this is the way that governments get to spend money, because they are the only ones who can make money in the literal sense of printing dollar bills and pound notes. So the effect of that, of course, is to drive up prices, inflation. And what happens with these companies, and this is, by the way, not unique to food companies, it's true of construction companies and so on, is that their costs start rising. And so they have two choices. One, they can say, we'll raise prices and pass these costs to the consumer, but that's a little bit difficult and risky because the consumer may decide, I'm going to go shop somewhere else. So a much easier option, let me degrade the quality of my product. I'm not going to use as good building materials. I'm not going to use as good cotton in making the shirts. I'm going to instead of using expensive ingredients in food, I'll substitute cheaper ingredients. So you see here a way in which food because I mean, people notice in your ordinary life, somehow things just don't have the same quality that they used to have before. But the government does not want to say, you know what, we're to blame for that because we print a whole lot of money, and that puts these companies in a position where degrading their products becomes, in fact, perhaps the easy way to deal with the problem that we, the government, have created. So here I think we see, the ways in which all of this is now being re-examined. I mean, what I find surprising but also exhilarating is that at this stage of life and at this stage of our politics, we're taking a new look at the institutions that we have taken for granted for so long and asking, are they really serving our interests in the way that we, I think, kind of innocently presume that they were?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the real promise of Make America Healthy Again. And it's also, like I say, it's the threat too, because we have these entrenched interests, because we, I mean, it's a natural thing to be tied to doing government in a particular way. We've done government for a certain way for 70 years or 100 years or however long, and it seems sort of to work. And so we're kind of habituated to it. But actually what RFK Jr. is saying is, look at the fruits of this. Look at how, the promise of public health was to make people healthier, to make people happier, to allow them to live their lives better, to allow people to enjoy the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. And in actual fact, people are sicker, more dependent, more unhappy, more unhealthy than they've ever been before. So, maybe it is time for a fundamental rethink. But I think the inflation point is a good point too, because it's worth noting as well, actually, that inflation is being used as a weapon to wean people off animal foods in favor of this plant-based agenda, the climate change agenda. So there was a very interesting op-ed that was written in the summer of 2022 when the pandemic was still taking place and when inflation was really starting to bite. It was written, I think, in the New York Times. And the author of this op-ed said, look, inflation's a good thing. Inflation can drive welcome change in people's consumer habits. Meat becoming more expensive, eggs and dairy becoming more expensive, that's a great thing, because look, we want people to eat less meat and fewer eggs and less dairy because we need to save the planet. So there's the kind of, like you said, there's the kind of general inflation that comes from bad monetary policy where you're just printing lots of money. But there's also actually a sense in which governments are trying to, and NGOs and sort of well-meaning organizations are trying to weaponize inflation as well to drive other forms of dietary change that would be, I think, equally harmful, like a transition to a global plant-based diet, for example.
Guys, check out the book. It's the Eggs Benedict option. I've been talking to Charles Cornish Dale, Raw Egg Nationalist, the website raweggstack.com. Follow him on X at babygravy9. Charles, a real pleasure. Thank you for joining me.
Likewise, Dinesh. Thank you.
I'm continuing my discussion of the big lie. We are in a section in which I've been talking about the way in which the old progressive eugenics movement very cunningly after World War II transformed itself into a population control movement, and then even later into a choice or a pro-choice movement, disguising its true ancestry and its real objectives. Now, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, the kind of poster organization for choice or for pro-choice, Margaret Sanger actually opposed choice. She thought that people who are from the fit, meaning from the better, from the upper class, from the favored groups, should have more children and should be encouraged to do so. Not required to do so, but encouraged to do so. But people who are from the unfit, the so-called human weeds, must be not only discouraged, but compelled not to have children. Here, Margaret Sanger drew the line. She did not hesitate to advocate segregation, something that was practiced, and she did not hesitate to advocate forced sterilization, something that was also done in the United States. Now, after Sanger's death, and as the whole idea of forced sterilization lost its cachet, the civil rights movement, the end of World War II, the expose of all the Nazi atrocities, Planned Parenthood began to emphasize just this idea of choice. We are for giving people a choice, but the idea was never about choice per se. And here's what I mean by this. Planned Parenthood doesn't advocate that people merely choose. It has a powerful advocacy for choosing abortion. So it's putting two options in front of you, but it's always urging you to check one box. And why is that? Well, the first reason, there's an ideological reason, and then there is a commercial reason. The commercial reason is obvious. Planned Parenthood profits immensely from abortion. Planned Parenthood doesn't profit from contraception, partly because contraception is so cheap. Abortions, on the other hand, are costly. And so Planned Parenthood makes money. It is the prime entrepreneur of the abortion industry. And so it also lobbies, by the way, heavily for something that it's not been successful with, at least not in a long time, and that is federal funding for abortion. Planned Parenthood frames this again in terms of rights. People have a right to something, and if you have a right to something, then shouldn't the government be paying for it? Shouldn't the government guarantee that you can exercise that right? What is the point of having a right if you don't have the means to provide for that right? And yet, if you apply this logic, you realize that it doesn't apply to any of our fundamental rights. You have a First Amendment right to speak. Does the government, in fact, provide you with the means to own a newspaper or have your own TV station or fund your podcast? No. You have to do that on your own dime. You have a Second Amendment right to own a gun. Does the government, in fact, buy you ammunition? Does it provide you with ARs and handguns? No, you got to go do that on your own. You have a right to assemble. Does the government give you free tabs for Uber and plane tickets so that you can assemble in Washington, D.C. if you want to? No, you got to go on your own. So the point I'm trying to make, and you can kind of go down the enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights, none of them are automatically funded by the government. So this logic that sort of a right, in order to be a right, needs to be bankrolled by the state is preposterous. It doesn't apply to any right. And it gives you the idea that from the point of view of Planned Parenthood, abortion is not a normal right. It's a super right. I've sometimes said in the past that in the church of modern liberalism, abortion is a sacrament. And this is certainly true when it comes to Planned Parenthood. Now, when you think about this pro-choice kind of rhetoric, this pro-choice doctrine, a doctrine that, by the way, since Roe versus Wade, has resulted just in an absolute, you may say, American Holocaust, in the sense that you have had millions of unborn children killed as a result of this doctrine and these policies. And of course, the law, Roe versus Wade, the right that had been enshrined in the Supreme Court for so many years before it was toppled in the Dobbs decision. Even the gross numbers of the Holocaust, the kind of talismanic or the kind of the famous 6 million number, is overshadowed. If you just simply went back to 1973 and just made a tally, you'd discover that the abortion toll is bigger. Now, where did the left get this pro-choice doctrine from? I think when you think back to the history of the Democratic Party, you get the answer to that question. And that is that the Democrats got their pro-choice doctrine from slavery. In other words, it's the same doctrine that they used to have in their days of slavery. Now, this is not really entirely surprising, right? Usually when someone comes up with something and they present it as new, it might be somewhat new to you or to the people who hear it for the first time. But then when you dig into the person's past, you realize, oh, wait, this is kind of the way he used to be, or this is what he used to think before, or he's taken something that he used to apply in one context and is now deploying it in another context. And so the DNA, the kind of way of thinking of the Democratic Party, it's changed in some ways, and the issues are different, but the habits are the same. The DNA of the party, Debbie likes to talk about the DNA of the Democrats. The DNA of the Democrats is the same. And let's go back to slavery and see if we can identify where this pro-choice doctrine can be found. And the answer is actually kind of obvious. It's not to be found in the Southern Democrats. It is to be found in the Northern Democrats led by Stephen Douglas. So what was the Douglas doctrine of popular sovereignty? I've talked about this. You probably recall it, but I'm going to remind you. Popular sovereignty is simply the idea that each community, each territory, and by extension, each state, should decide for itself if it wants to have slavery. As Douglas put it, Douglas said, hey, listen, I'm not for slavery, but, neither am I really against it. I think that slavery should be left up to each group, each community. Each community is fully capable of making its own decision. Douglas goes, hey, listen, we live in a big country. Some people think this, some people think that about slavery, and we're not going to get everybody to agree. We're not going to put everybody on the same page. We kind of have to agree to disagree. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is moral diversity. We're going to let Indiana do it one way, and we're going to let New York do it another way. We're going to let Florida do it a third way, and Texas do it a fourth way. So each state, each community, each group can make its own decision, can be free to choose how it wants to go up or down on slavery. So for Douglas, the slavery problem could be solved through a pro-choice solution. Now, obviously, the pro-choice that I'm talking about in connection with abortion is a little different. In the case of Douglas, we were talking about the choice of a community. Now we are talking about the choice of an individual. In other words, do you want to keep your child or do you want to kill it? That's really the abortion question But it's not all that different from the slavery question that the Northern Democrats framed this way. Do you want to have slaves or do you not as a group? Your community can make that decision. So even though we are transposing from a group under slavery to an individual under abortion, if you think about it, the logic is exactly the same. And that is, people will say, and the Planned Parenthood people, if you would have the head of Planned Parenthood right now, on MSNBC or Fox News, he or she would say something like this. People disagree about abortion. I'm not for it. They love to say, I'm opposed to it, or I'm not against it either. I just think that it's something that we should leave up to a matter of choice. We are, after all, a big country. Not all of us agree about this issue. We sort of have to agree to disagree, and that means that each individual should be making a choice for himself or for herself. And of course, in the case of abortion, for herself, because it is the woman's right to choose. Now, choice, in other words, is simply transposed from the middle of the 19th century as it was articulated by Douglas right up to the present. And now I'm going to read the conclusion of this chapter and close us out on this topic in this way, and then we'll take up a new theme from The Big Lie next time. Just as Douglas ignored the rights of slaves, presuming that they have no stake in their freedom, so too does the left ignore the right to life of developing offspring, presuming that they have no stake in whether they live or die. The unborn child of today, just like the slave of old, is considered a tool for someone else's benefit and convenience. He or she is a non-person, or at least an entirely disposable person. In this respect, the lethal and dehumanizing Nazi mindset lives on.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and SalemNow.com.